Nobody knew that the phone call Michael Jackson made in the summer of 1993, at the peak of his fame, in the middle of the most brutal crisis of his life, would be the moment he lost the only person in his inner circle who had ever truly known him, and that everything he had whispered in private was already gone. That sentence needs a moment. Sit with it. Because what happened to Michael Jackson in the summer of 1993 was not just a betrayal. It was the specific, surgical destruction of the one thing a person at his level of fame almost never gets to have. Not money, not talent, not fame. Something rarer than all of those. Someone who actually knew him. The real him. Not the icon. Not the mythology. Not the face on the poster. The frightened, brilliant, heartbreakingly lonely man behind all of it. And when that person made their choice, Michael Jackson went from being the most famous human being on earth to being completely, utterly, irreversibly alone. This is the story no headline ever told. Not the trial, not the tabloids, not the accusations and the settlements and the media circus that swallowed years of his life. This is the story underneath all of that, the one that explains why a man who made the whole world feel something could never quite locate that feeling for himself. To understand it, you have to go back further than 1993. You have to go back to Gary, Indiana, to a small house with too many people in it, and a father who had decided, with the cold clarity of someone who has never confused love with strategy, that his children's talent was a resource, not a gift, a resource, to be extracted, managed, deployed. Joseph Jackson ran rehearsals with the discipline of someone who believed that excellence required fear. And he was not entirely wrong. The Jackson Five were extraordinary, and they became extraordinary partly because failure had consequences that a child remembers. But what that environment produces in the child at the center of it, the one carrying the most talent and therefore subjected to the most pressure, is something that follows them for the rest of their life. It teaches you that closeness is not safe, that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are also the people most capable of making their love conditional. That warmth and extraction are not opposites, that they can exist in the same relationship, sometimes so intertwined that you cannot separate them, sometimes so seamlessly blended that you cannot see where one ends and the other begins. Michael Jackson learned that before he learned long division, and the lesson never left him. By the time he was the most famous entertainer in the history of recorded music, by the time Thriller had sold more copies than anything before it, by the time stadiums across 3 continents were filling with people who had saved for months just to be in the same building as him for 2 hours, his capacity to trust another human being had been compressed into something very small, very carefully guarded, and very rarely offered. He performed for millions. He was warm on camera in the way that only people with genuine warmth can be, because you cannot fake that quality at scale for that long. But the actual interior life, the fears, the grief, the loneliness that went bone deep, that stayed hidden, behind the music, behind the performances, behind the walls of Neverland, which was not eccentricity but armor. A man building a world he could control because the one outside had never once felt safe. And then someone got through. The person in question had been in Michael's professional orbit for years before the real trust developed. They were competent. They were consistent. They showed up when things were difficult and did not seem to want anything beyond the work. They were present during the creative blocks. the media storms, the periods when Michael's relationship with his own body and mind was visibly under strain. They listened. They did not seem to be calculating. And so Michael, who almost never did this, opened a door. He talked about his father, about the rehearsals and the punishments and the specific grief of a man who had achieved everything the world had to offer and could never quite locate the childhood he had been asked to trade for it. He talked about the loneliness, not the poetic loneliness of the famous, but the grinding, daily, specific loneliness of being surrounded by people whose interest in you is fundamentally about what you can do for them. He talked about the fear that never went away, the low-grade, constant fear that everything could reverse, that the world which had decided to love Michael Jackson could decide something else just as quickly, with just as little warning. He shared things with this person he had not shared with anyone. The architecture of his interior life, room by room, door by door, with a trust that was all the more complete for being so rare. And the entire time, every conversation, every confidence, every moment of genuine vulnerability, that person was paying attention in a very different way than Michael understood. Every disclosure noted, every private detail filed, every fear and confession and unguarded moment registered and stored, not as the sacred thing that trust makes of shared information, but as material, as future currency. Michael had no idea, because what he was receiving back felt exactly like trust. That is the specific cruelty of this kind of betrayal. It does not announce itself. It wears the face of the very thing it is destroying. But here's what you still haven't heard. And this changes everything. By the summer of 1993, Michael Jackson was already fracturing from the inside out. The Dangerous World Tour was pushing him past limits he had been approaching for years. The dependency on prescription painkillers, which had begun after a back injury during a commercial shoot years earlier and had deepened with every punishing rehearsal cycle since, was no longer something that could be quietly managed. He was sleeping in fragments, eating erratically. The perfectionism that made his performances extraordinary was also making everything else unsustainable in ways that were becoming visible to anyone paying close attention. He told one person how bad it had really gotten. Just one. He described the nights when the pain was severe enough that the only way through it was medication that left him feeling simultaneously present and completely absent from his own life. He described the fear of losing control of something he could not name. He described what it felt like to stand in front of 80,000 people and perform at a level of intensity that would have been demanding for someone in perfect health, while his body was quietly staging a rebellion. The person listened, said the right things, was present in exactly the way someone needs another person to be present when they are telling the truth about something that frightens them. Only weeks later, in August of 1993, an accusation surfaced. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The media apparatus that had spent years building Michael Jackson into a global mythology was now running the same machinery in reverse, with equal efficiency and considerably more appetite. He tried to reach one person. His hands were shaking when he dialed, not from the medication but from something more fundamental. He needed a voice that knew him, not the brand, not the legal situation, not the tabloid story. Just Michael, the person who had heard the things he had said in the dark. The phone was answered, and the voice on the other end was wrong. Not wrong in a way that was immediately obvious. Wrong the way cold is wrong after warmth. The same voice, entirely different temperature. He held the phone for a long time after the line went quiet, not moving, not speaking, processing something that did not have language yet, because there is a kind of pain that does not arrive all at once. It arrives in layers. Each layer reveals something worse than the one before. The first layer was abandonment. The person he had trusted most had chosen, at the exact moment of maximum crisis, to protect themselves. The second layer came in the following days. Specific details began appearing in print. Private things, things that could only have come from a very small number of sources. Things Michael had said in what he believed was the safety of a genuine relationship. The third layer, the one that took longest and hit hardest, was the realization that the betrayal had not begun with the phone call. It had been building quietly for a long time, that every confidence he had shared, every door he had opened, had been received not as trust, but as inventory. And still, and still. He had only minutes before he had to stand in front of cameras and face the world. That is who Michael Jackson was. That is the specific weight of his situation. The interior life had to stay interior, because the exterior life had demands that did not pause for grief. They did not pause for the quiet collapse of the only thing that had ever felt genuinely real. So he put his face on. He went out. He performed. And then he went home and sat with it alone. Now, here is what you haven't been told. The thing that gets buried under everything else and is more important than any of it. What do you do with a betrayal at that depth? If you are Michael Jackson, if you cannot simply disappear and grieve in private, if every move you make is being documented, if the story of your worst moments is being sold to newspapers while you are still living inside them, what do you actually do? Ask yourself that honestly. If you had spent your entire life being watched, if the people who were supposed to protect you had treated your gifts as products, if you had finally let someone in, and that person had done this, would you ever let anyone in again? Most people would answer no. Most people would be completely justified. He went back to the music, not immediately. The months that followed were brutal in ways that are difficult to overstate. The legal proceedings, the settlement, the media coverage that had no structural interest in complexity or truth. Michael sought treatment for the dependency that had been worsening for years. He retreated to Neverland, and then retreated from that too, moving between properties like a man who could not locate a place that felt safe, because safety had recently revealed itself to be something that could be constructed over years and dismantled in a single phone call. But then he came back to the studio, and what came out was different from anything that had come before. History, released in 1995, does not attempt subtlety. Scream is a 2.5-minute act of pure, undisguised rage at a media apparatus that had decided what his story was before it asked him a single honest question. "They don't care about us" is a protest and a wound simultaneously. And Stranger in Moscow, quiet, glacial, the most emotionally honest thing he had recorded to that point, was written during the tour, during the collapse, during the exact period when he was discovering in real time the full dimensions of what had been done to him. He talked about writing it once. He said he was in Moscow, standing at a hotel window, watching rain move across the glass. There were crowds below. There were always crowds, and he had never felt more completely alone in his life. He said the song arrived without effort, that it came from somewhere that had no other exit. That is what real betrayal does to a real artist. It does not destroy the work. It strips away the last of the defenses that were preventing the work from being fully honest. What remains is more true than anything that came before, not by choice, but because the thing that was protecting the truth from full exposure has been removed. The betrayal had already taken what he was guarding, so he gave it himself in the music, on his own terms, where it could become something other than evidence against him. Understand what that means. The most painful period of his life became the most creatively honest period of his life. The theft forced the gift. The damage created the document. Here is something almost no one asks. What does it cost a person to keep giving after giving has already proven dangerous? To stand at a microphone and offer something real after the last real thing you offered was taken from you and used in ways you never could have imagined. To keep making work that asks the people who hear it to feel something, to trust something, to believe in something, after trust has shown you exactly what it can cost. Most people, after a betrayal of this depth, build walls, reasonable walls, justified walls, walls that say, I will no longer offer the part of myself that can be taken and used, because I have learned that the offering is not safe. Michael did not do that. He could not, because the part of him that could be taken and used was also the part of him that made the music what it was. The openness that allowed someone to hurt him was the same openness that allowed him to reach millions of people in the specific way he reached them, not as entertainment, but as recognition, as the feeling of being understood by something outside yourself. You cannot surgically remove one without the other. They are the same door. So he kept the door open, and he kept getting hurt, and he kept making things that were true. The years that followed were not kind. The second set of accusations in 2003 reignited everything. The trial, the acquittal that came too late to undo the damage, the financial collapse, the exile, the slow erosion of everything that had once seemed solid. Each crisis layers on the one before it, and a person can only carry so much accumulated weight before the way they move through the world begins to show it. But through every year of it, Michael Jackson kept making music, kept showing up to studios, kept delivering when he stood at a microphone, something that made the people in the room go silent, not because of technique, though the technique remained extraordinary, but because of truth. Because whatever was happening inside him kept finding its way into the work in a way that could not be manufactured and could not be faked. The betrayal had taken his privacy. It had not taken his voice. In the last months of his life, rehearsing for the This Is It concerts in London, 50 nights, the largest residency ever planned, Michael Jackson was dancing with the commitment of someone who has been doing this since before most people in the room were born. He was tired in the way that a body carries decades of extraordinary demand. But something in his eyes, in the specific quality of his attention when the music started, was completely and unmistakably alive. He was 50 years old. He had been performing for 45 of those years. He had been betrayed by the people he trusted and pursued by institutions that wanted to diminish him, and misrepresented by a media apparatus that found the mythology more profitable than the truth. He had every reason in the world to protect what remained, to give less, to keep more of himself in reserve. Instead, he was in a rehearsal room at midnight, working on a show that the world had not yet earned, demanding of himself a level of excellence that most people in their 20s cannot sustain. That was his answer, not to the betrayal specifically, to all of it. to every person who had ever taken something from him and left, to every institution that had tried to reduce him to a transaction, to every headline that had chosen sensation over the complicated, irreducible truth of who he actually was. The answer was the work. It was always the work. It was the stage, the music, the note held one beat longer than seems possible, the move that should not work but does, the 3 in the morning session where something gets made that has never existed before and will never exist in quite that way again. He died on June 25, 2009. He never performed those 50 concerts. The world never saw what that show would have been. But here is what the world did get. Here is what the betrayal, and every other betrayal, every brutal year, every crisis that would have finished someone with less at the center of them, could not take. Man in the mirror asks you to look at yourself honestly. Will you be there, reaches toward something sacred without embarrassment or irony? Heal the World assumes that the person listening is capable of caring about something beyond themselves. These songs exist because a man who had every reason to stop believing in human connection kept believing in it anyway, who kept making work that assumed the listener was capable of feeling something real, who kept, right up until the end, offering something genuine to a world that had shown him, repeatedly and painfully, what genuine things sometimes cost. The greatest music of his life came after the worst moments of his life. That is not coincidence. That is what happens when someone with extraordinary gifts decides, consciously or not, that the gifts belong to the world regardless of what the world has done with the trust that came alongside them. He gave the world the music. He carried the rest himself. And the music outlasted everything that tried to diminish it. Every betrayal, every headline, every person who mistook access for understanding and proximity for knowing. None of them could touch what he made. None of them ever did. That is something no betrayal, however calculated, however complete, however carefully built over years of false closeness, can ever take from the world that received it. He left behind something that belongs to everyone who has ever felt unseen and found in a song, the specific relief of being recognized. And that belongs to him. It always did. It always will. There is one more layer to this story, one that almost never gets mentioned because it requires holding two uncomfortable truths at the same time. Michael Jackson knew something was wrong before the betrayal was complete. Not with certainty, not in a way that produced evidence he could point to, but in the specific, felt way that people who have spent a lifetime reading rooms and managing the gap between what people present and what they want. In that way, he knew. Something had shifted in the quality of the attention he was receiving. Warmth had become slightly more professional. Presence had become slightly more strategic. The temperature had dropped by a degree or two in a way that was easy to explain away but impossible for someone with his particular sensitivity to entirely ignore. He felt it weeks before the phone call, maybe longer, and he said nothing. There are several ways to read that silence, and most of them are too easy. Denial, the very human, completely understandable refusal to investigate something that, if confirmed, would cost you the only thing that felt real. Exhaustion. By 1993, Michael Jackson had been managing the demands of global superstardom for over 2 decades, and the additional work of actively interrogating the loyalty of the one person he had allowed close may simply have exceeded what he had available. But there is a third reading, one that is harder to arrive at but may be the most honest. Maybe he stayed silent because he had already understood, somewhere below conscious thought, that the alternative was a version of himself he could not afford to become. A version that trusted nothing, opened nothing, gave nothing beyond the performance. A version that was safe in the way that a sealed room is safe. Nothing gets in, nothing gets hurt, nothing gets taken. And also nothing lives. He could not be that person and also make the music he made. The same quality that made him vulnerable to what happened was the same quality that made You Are Not Alone reach people the way it reached them, in the part of themselves they had been most carefully guarding. You cannot engineer that quality from the outside. You cannot perform it. It either comes from a person who is genuinely, dangerously open to the full range of human experience, including the painful parts, especially the painful parts, or it does not come at all. Michael Jackson chose again and again to remain that person, not without cost, not without knowing the cost, but because the alternative was a kind of safety that looked, from the inside, like a different kind of death. That is not a small thing to understand about someone. It changes how you hear the music. It changes what it means that the music exists at all. Because here is the truth that gets lost in every simplified version of his story. Michael Jackson was not a victim who happened to also be an artist. He was an artist who understood, with a clarity that most people never have to develop, exactly what his art required of him, and who kept paying that price year after year, betrayal after betrayal, crisis after crisis, right up until the end. The people who betrayed him are various. Their names matter less than the pattern. Someone gets close, gets given something real, decides that the real thing is worth more as currency than as trust, takes it, leaves, and Michael Jackson gets up, goes back to the studio, makes something that reaches millions of people in the part of themselves they keep most carefully hidden. That cycle repeated itself across decades. It would be easy to read it as tragedy, and it was tragic in the specific way that any life spent paying a price that most people never have to pay is tragic. But it was also something else. It was a sustained, lifelong act of insisting that the world contained things worth offering yourself to, even when the world had repeatedly demonstrated that it would not always be careful with what was offered. The O2 Arena in London was ready. The stage had been built. 50 nights. The largest concert residency ever announced. And Michael Jackson, 50 years old, carrying everything, tired in ways that rest could not reach, was showing up to rehearsals and doing the thing he had always done. He was giving everything, every night, right up until the morning when he couldn't anymore. That is who he was. That is the story that survives everything else. Not the mythology, not the tragedy, not the tabloid version, which was never about him and was always about what his story could be made to mean for other people's purposes. The truth is simpler and more durable than any of that. He was someone who kept showing up, who kept giving, who kept making things that were honest. And the next time one of those songs finds you at exactly the right moment, the next time something he made reaches the part of you that you keep most carefully protected and makes you feel, for a few minutes, less alone in it, that is him, still answering. Still reaching across whatever distance separates a person who made something true from a person who needed it. That connection is real. It was always real. And no one who ever betrayed his trust can take credit for it, diminish it, or touch it in any way at all. It was his. He gave it to you, and it will be here long after every other version of his story has finally, mercifully, been allowed to rest. What the betrayal did, ultimately, was not what the person who committed it intended. Betrayal at that depth rarely produces the outcome the betrayer expects. They expect to take something. They expect to gain something. They expect their calculation to yield a return proportionate to what they extracted. What they do not expect is that the person they betrayed will take the wound and make something with it. Will go into a recording studio with the full weight of what happened and come out with a song that 50 years from now will still be making people feel seen. Stranger in Moscow, Scream, Will You Be There? These exist because of everything Michael Jackson went through, not despite it. The betrayal did not produce them, but it removed the last of the protection that was standing between him and the kind of honesty those songs required. It forced open a door that his own caution might never have fully opened. That is the thing about people who are genuinely, recklessly open, not as a strategy, not as a performance of vulnerability, but as a fundamental condition of how they exist in the world. When something is taken from them, they do not have the option of closing down that part of themselves, because that part of themselves is not separate from the rest. It is not a room with a lockable door. It is load-bearing. Who exactly was the person at the center of this story? The full answer is still contested. What is not contested is that during the chaos of 1993, someone from Michael Jackson's closest circle made a choice that changed him permanently, and that the evidence of what that choice cost him is audible in every record he made afterward. The name may never be agreed upon, but the wound left a mark that millions of people have heard without knowing what they were hearing. And now you know. He left behind a world full of people who feel less alone because of what he made. That is something no betrayal, however calculated, however complete, can ever take back.